So my name is Jeff Day. I'm the director of the architecture program. I think most of you probably know that, but just in case. And I welcome you to the next talk in our series, What's Next? This series is, as you know, we're asking questions about the next, what's next for our disciplines, what's the sort of future of our various fields represented in the college. And so we've got a series of speakers coming in addressing this through their work. And tonight, Florian Idenburg is joining us. He's a founding partner of Solid Objectives Idenburg Liu, or SOIL, which is a firm based in Brooklyn in New York. Florian is also an associate professor of practice in architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. But he's also taught at Columbia, at Brown, and University of Kentucky, where he held the Foreman Chair in Urban Design. He's been an awardee, a winner, I guess, of the Charlotte Kohler Prize, which is an award, a very substantial award in the Netherlands, and a finalist for the Prix de Rome in the Netherlands as well. He studied architecture at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And after he received his master's, he worked from 2000 to 2007 with SANAA, which, as you know, is Sejima's firm based in Tokyo. And he worked in the firm for 8 years, but part of that time in Japan and part of that time in the U.S., managing their two first substantial projects in the U.S., the Toledo Museum of Art and the Glass Pavilion at the Toledo Museum of Art. If some of you have seen that, it's an absolutely spectacular building. I think it's probably the most precisely built building I've seen in many years in the United States. And then he was also responsible for the new Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, in the Bowery, which is a very different building. Both of these are SANAA buildings, and after that, they began the firm. He founded the firm with Jing Liu, his partner, who's from China, and they now have a third partner from Greece. So it's a very international firm based in New York. The work, if you're familiar with it, is quite unique. There's a great variety of approaches to some very unique problems. Many of the projects are cultural. Some projects are museum exhibitions. Others are museum buildings. They have a building under construction right now in California that I'm sure you probably will see tonight. Yep. Very interesting museum. You may have heard of them first through Pole Dance, which was their winning entry to the Moma PS1 Young Architects program. This is the program where architects are selected to build an outdoor space at Moma PS1 in Queens for a summer series of events. And so they had a very interesting proposal for that was installed for its year. So I will, without further ado, invite Florian to give the talk. And if you have any questions afterwards, I'm sure there'll be time for questions and answers. Otherwise, enjoy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's see how this Thanks. So then it was 2008, and me being Dutch, Jing being from China, for some reason we thought architecture, it is the idea that you design things, you plan things, and then you realize them a little bit later. And so the thinking of what do we do as architects was, when we started our firm, was very straightforward. We will design buildings in this world, and we will build them. And then a week or a month after we incorporated our firm, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Half of the architects in New York lost their job. 1/3 of the offices closed, and suddenly we had to think, hey, what does an architect actually do, or how are we as architects completely connected to other systems, and systems that are very unstable and unpredictable, and how can you as an architect, claim that when you design something in a couple of years from now, something will be realized that is better if we live in an incredible volatile environment. Not much later, Sandy also happened. And is this something we can design against? Can we, as designers, think in ways that these things don't happen anymore? Is that what architecture can do? And another big disruptor that we realized is obviously the way we are now connected to each other. May be in the past physical space, organized social relationships. Now that doesn't do it anymore. And so we realized as sort of our discussion started in the office that we needed to rethink maybe how to practice in a very unstable, unpredictable, and indeterminate society. And so To Be Determined, which was the lecture of tonight, I don't know if that was announced, but it's always most people who organize lectures find it really annoying when they ask for the lecture title and I say it's To Be Determined. But it is To Be Determined. Because it stands for a way in which we have tried to address practice in a very unpredictable time. It stands for two things. On the one hand, determination, to actually make physical buildings in our world. And at the same time, it speaks to an interest in indeterminacy, instability, a certain uncertainty, maybe even leaving things open, not defining things from the get-go, not designing such that the thing you think in the beginning you need to realize exactly in that way, and everything that veers off from that is failure. So it's interested in processes as well, and sort of surprises that come along the way. And so I have a few projects I will show tonight. And I will try to talk about elements that we design as architects. Very simple things, structures, skins, volumes, but I will speak to them through a number of projects. And I will show them in relation also to temporary installations. We do a lot of temporary exhibition, pavilion type things to test things as well, to find new ways and new ideas that we then later can incorporate in real buildings. And so I'll show quickly two early temporary things we did. It was already mentioned that we were the lucky winners in 2009, 2010 we built it, so right after the financial collapse of the PS1 Young Architects program, which is a program organized by Moma, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In the back you see Manhattan, in the front you see PS1. PS1 is in Queens, on the other side of the river. And it's a place for contemporary art, an old school, public school one that turned into a contemporary arts space. And in the front they have this courtyard. And every summer they ask 5 architects to come up with an idea to create an environment in this courtyard, because they have a program called the Warm-Up Series, which is basically a series of events with DJs, bands, beers, and a way for people to enjoy the summer who maybe people can't afford leaving the city but still want to find sort of an escape. At the same time, so that program, which we won as a competition, it's a very simple question: design a party environment. At the same time, it's a very difficult question because it is for Moma, and Moma also asks you to respond to what is architecture today, or like how design an installation that in some way is of the now. And so there's a couple of ideas that went into this proposition. On the one hand, we were still, or we were very much interested in this idea of instability and in the unpredictability and collapse. And at the same time, Moma is in a way the gate or the treasurer of the modern movement. This idea that through design and through design thinking, we can come up with structures that help organize our life. And we started to so look into the history of the Moma itself. This is a dance by Oskar Schlemmer, who was a Bauhaus choreographer, called Pfahlentans, or pole dance. Pfahlentans is the German translation of that. But it basically speaks, it's sort of an exercise or a study in the relationship between humans and structure. And he was interested in trying to find sort of the way we as people behave in structure, but also giving structure sort of a human character. And so we started to think of this white Cartesian grid, the modernist grid, in a way standing for the idea of modernity. But then, rather than a stable grid, we wanted to make a weak grid, a grid that is actually not holding anything up, but is actually always on the verge of collapse, that is flexible and pliable, and doesn't offer support, but actually only offers imbalance. And we thought of this idea to cover the entire courtyard with this weak system, this white gridded system, but made out of fiberglass poles held together with bungee cords, and then populated with activators, things that would make people interact with this system. The idea being that we are actually responsible for these systems. We inhabit these systems, and if we start to interact with them, we might cause ripples, and we might cause deformations, and we might cause collapse. And so we went to Moma and we said, we're going to fill this courtyard with a system that's always on the verge of collapse. And we realized it's probably not a good idea to propose that when there's 4,000 drunk people there listening to bands and DJs. So the day before the presentation, we quickly faked this image in Photoshop, and we grabbed a logo from Bureau Happold, which is a big engineering firm in New York. And we said, we understand it's very risky, but don't worry, the whole thing has been calculated, and it will stand. And so Moma said, that's great, you win. And so we called Bureau Happold, and we said, congratulations, we won. And they said, what did we win? And we said, well, we have this idea of this system that is continuously being fed with unpredictable inputs that can collapse at any moment. And he said, that's great, but the funny thing is this cannot be calculated. This is the opposite of what we do as engineers. What we do is we design risk outside of this, out of the system, and what you want to do is infuse the system with as much unpredictability as possible. And so all you can do is build it. And so we went to the courtyard, and we started to test. This is Ilias, who now became partner. He was our first staff. And you see the elements that it is made up of. And we were trying to find a way in which this system was dancing and sort of finding its balance, but also, led to certain instability in a certain way. And you see the activators. We had hooks and balls. I will speak about those in a little bit. And so that looked really great. And then we went home, and we got an email from the caretaker at PS1 saying, can you please come and clean out the mess? We have a donor event tomorrow. So. And so we realized that this thing, through trial and error, we ultimately found, sort of by calibrating, here you see the amount of cells and the tightness of the knots, we were able to find a balance within the system, and gradually sort of this supplely responsive system started to emerge within the courtyard, which then was activated by these balls. This was in a way also alluding to our more sort of the virtual realm, which to an extent seems more playful, and we wanted to create things that people could invent games and start playing with. And so these were images we found online on social media showing how people started to actually work within this system. So this was a system that had a certain definition to it, but at the same time was left open for interpretation and play. And later we worked with other people that were interested in doing performances in this. We worked with a composer who connected the system to a sound system where you could move the poles and they would change the sounds. There was actually a dance being done by a group called Body and Pole, which were professional. It's the American champion pole dancing, who did a performance in here. And so this idea of an open system where you give a certain definition and you allow people to find ways to occupy it and work with it. So that was one temporary installation, but then That's nice within the confines of, say, the art museum and the institute. But how, if you really want to operate in the real world, how do you we had to sort of develop an attitude for that too. So the second temporary installation one we did recently speaks a little bit to that. This image speaks about the system maybe on the left, which is say the architectural industrial complex, if you want, the way in which our discipline is pushed by numbers, by performance, by data, and what have you, and we sort of in the middle trying to create sort of a space that to an extent pushes back. So how can you create maybe space that is in between, that is not necessarily part of the budgets that architecture buys, or the performance that buildings have to do. And I think this project will clarify this. This is a temporary or a response to the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennale, where we were asked in 2010 to do to respond to a brief, which was it was redoing the Strada Novissima, which was the 1984 Venice Biennale idea of a series of architects making facades. And so 12 architects here were asked to make a facade, just a screen, a flat, thin thing, and behind this facade show their work. So this is like a booth. This was the street. Here was the next architect. Here's the next architect. And we had like a depth of maybe 10 feet or something to do an installation. But the brief was make a screen and show your work behind. Saying that these days architects can only deal with the facade. The facade is actually, everything else gets decided by real estate rules or by code. And where we have as a space to play as architects to be creative is the facade. And we thought it was a very sad idea that our scope and our brief has been reduced to the thinness of a curtain wall. And we started to think, what is a deep facade? And can we think of a space that is actually, can we deepen the facade itself and create sort of a space that maybe is not accounted for in today's architecture? And so we looked at the colonnade. The colonnade is a very typical ancient type of a row of columns in front of a building. And rather than, and so we started to work with that as a front, and this is the plan. But then within that colonnade, we created sort of this bracketed space, and to the outside the space looks very stable with marble veneer columns, 1 millimeter thick, but the other sides were clad with mirror. And so as soon as you enter this space that looks very stable from the front, you go in and you realize that there's sort of an endless space within. So this speaks to a desire to find sort of a deepened space, a space in between, say, the program that we're asked for and the exterior. And so these three, now I will show some projects that speak about this openness, the undefined edge, and later also about presence. So this speaks about how to organize, how to create a border, and also how to create a volume, if you want. And so the open system, this is the example I showed with PS1. Now for a permanent building, I show a competition entry we did a couple of years, maybe 3 years ago in Belgium for a Museum of Contemporary Art in the heart of a historic town. This picture is of a wall here, and here in the middle you see an old monastery and a church that was bombed in the Second World War here in this beautiful old historic town in the northern part of Belgium, very typical medieval city. And that center, this historic center, has turned into a very attractive but also very commercial center with retail and restaurants and cafes and what have you. And so in the middle of this town, actually behind this wall, is this oasis of space, the old monastery with the old bombed church as a ruin, the little houses where the nuns used to live. And then in 1958 they made the first purpose-built building for contemporary art in this space. And the way to enter is through this one gate, which you see over here. into this very pleasant courtyard, and then into the existing building. And so the brief was very simple and very typical these days: update this building to today's code, energy, and accessibility, and at the same time demolish this building, which is a building built in the 80s, and make this into one space for contemporary art. Because this is a museum, a state museum, so it's public money, it was very important that the public would engage with this. And so there was a real drive to make an opening towards this more commercial center, to break up the building actually, and find a way for this commercial world to enjoy and enter into this building. However, we thought there's something really exciting about the fact that you have to work a little bit to get into this space, and especially their programming. It's not very big name artists. It's actually young ideas, emerging ideas. There's sort of a do-it-self character to it, and we felt that if you would open this up to this commercial world, actually it might disappear and weaken. And so we started to work with a dynamic diagram that in a way was a generative diagram that helped us try to think about how to design this building, which was basically keeping this wall in a way as a certain, to have a certain resistance, that you had to work a little bit to get into the space, and that sort of pushing yourself through this wall would change your, would transform your ideas. And so we didn't want to make sort of a generic extension like this. We wanted to create something that would integrate on the right the old and on the left the new in white. And we started to think, can we come up with a very simple organizational system, because there's no collection. This museum doesn't have a collection. So how can we organize a system for ideas and artists that don't yet exist, but create a new infrastructure for sort of display within that. And we looked at what makes the existing building specific. It's actually not their spaces, but their openings. And we started to think, can we work with just the wall and the opening as a way to generate a scheme? And we looked at the traditional museum, which is basically the enfilade organization. It's a traditional way of say, storytelling in a museum. You go from room to room to room, and the curator can very precisely orchestrate your experience. And we thought that's too traditional for today. Then we looked at a more, say, modern idea of exhibition rooms, where the wall opens up at one end and space sort of flows from one in the other, which I think is a very sort of typical modernist idea. But we said, what is a way of navigating, what is a way of storytelling that fits with our age, in which we in a way tell our own stories, the way we browse through the internet, the way we curate our own visual say identity and collections through things like Pinterest and Instagram. How do we navigate space, contemporary space, in the physical realm? And so we made a very complicated looking script to impress our Belgian jury. But actually it's a very simple thing, which basically, this being the city, this being the beautiful garden, this being the old museum, that being the new. It was a very precise sort of calibration of openings and where they sit within the rooms, and that they would increase from the city towards the yard. So the further you get into the system, the more sort of porous and the more it opens up into the garden. And so the scheme we settled on was basically closed corners for concentration, and then where the rooms come together, actually the doors overlap, and it creates these portals. And that means that every time you come out of a room, it's up to the visitor to make a choice. Where do you go? How do you continue this story? It's a completely different way of thinking of how to organize a museum. And it would allow for completely new ways for curators to organize space, because, for instance, they could have parallel stories, parallel narratives happening within the same system. And so we took the old, we extended the new, and we cut these openings, and we changed also the existing building towards these openings. And so this is a model we made, and it showed that old and new came together not by adding, but actually by subtraction. And here you see the plan. And so there was this entrance towards the city. This is the commercial city, but you enter under the oblique, and you come back into the old entry hall. And from there you can move through these spaces, and then rather than actually fitting the program really precisely, because programs change continuously, we said you have a variety of rooms, a catalog of rooms in which different things can happen. It's a very simple but robust infrastructure, and with skylights and proportions we changed, so there was actually, although the system is very rigid, there was a lot of variety of spaces. And these spaces can be used for display, but they can also be used as library or reading room or what have you. And here you see the massing of the extension and the way it sits within this courtyard and becomes part of the urban fabric as a frame. And so we became second, which we do a lot. But then, is it now a year ago? No, maybe actually a year and a half ago, we were asked to make an exhibition in the Netherlands for a collection by a Dutch collector who had been collecting for 60 years, and this was the first time they were going to show their collection to the public at the Rijksmuseum or the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, which is the national or the public museum in Amsterdam, the large museum of contemporary art. And there we worked with the same system, and here it played a little bit of a different role. But here, this idea of choice, or as you as a visitor being forced to choose your path rather than being led by some curator or somebody else, resembled the way the collector made his own choices. So every space had an artist, but every time that you came out of a room, you had to choose what would be the next way in which you move through this space. Very similar to the choice that you as a collector are forced to make, and also trying to see sort of new relationships between these different artists that he and his wife had collected over the course of 60 years. So in some way, the structure here was trying to resemble this act of collecting and decision making and finding longer relationships in that collection. So that speaks about structure and the idea to think about it. Now, let's talk about edge. This is a project we completed in 2012, a gallery for contemporary art in Seoul, Korea. This is Seoul, looking from one of the hills in the north towards the more historic area where the gallery is situated. And here on the right, at the end, is the palace. And so this neighborhood that has a lot of beautiful old homes is sort of the housing where the people who worked in the palace used to live, and is now preserved or to an extent protected because it's one of the few historic areas in Seoul. And this is becoming a very popular area for tourists, and there's a lot of say coffee shops and other nice ways to spend your Sunday. Programs are moving in there, and also sort of a contemporary arts scene is moving into this place. And we came across this image, which is the same vantage point of that picture before. And the site actually of our building is sort of here. And what is very interesting about this image is that both background and foreground coexist within the same space. And also that the built and the natural actually are sort of a hybrid. So architecture and context are completely integrated, almost blurred in this sort of very hazy landscape. But this was actually a map. So what is also very interesting is that this is a graphic and precise depiction, but that also sort of depicts an atmosphere where normally our maps are not showing any sort of atmospheres, just factual information. So it's a contemporary arts gallery. They already had made two buildings. It's Kukje Gallery, so K1 and K2, and we were asked to make the third. And as contemporary art goes, we don't know what it's going to be, so make the biggest box possible is typically what is being asked when you have to make spaces for contemporary art. You see how these old historical homes around there, these are the courtyard homes, are being gradually sort of infiltrated by these larger anonymous white cubes for contemporary art. And so we looked at what was the biggest box possible there, zoning-wise, to fit within this area, column-free and tall, and to even emphasize sort of the clarity of this box. We pushed all circulation out. There's 2 floors of storage and a theater underneath. And so the elevator and this staircase takes you out of this box and into the spaces below. This is the entry, the vestibule, and this is a staircase to the roof from which you can see the palace. And so we were about to fly to Korea to present this project, and we thought this is way too hard and aggressive for this very fine-grained and soft and fine-mazed context. And so before we left, we sort of thought, let's wrap this thing in some sort of soft, permanent fog, some boundary that sort of erases this diagram, that creates a space in between, something that in a way evokes that image that we showed. And so we made this model, and we went to Korea, and our client is a very busy lady, and so she came, she took her sunglasses off, and she said, "I like it, make it," and she left. Seriously, that was what it took, 1 minute. She didn't ask, "What is it?" Because we had also no idea what it was. We just knew that we had to make it. And so then we had to think, well, what is this thing? What is it? How to make this? And we realized it has very complex geometry. We realized we didn't want to make, it was not about the geometry. This project is not about its form, so we didn't want to make that a very hard, say, articulated form. We didn't want to shingle, like build a structure and support it like the way Frank Gehry maybe would do it. So it needed to have sort of a softness, but at the same time, it's outside, there's snow, it needs to be strong, it needs to be able to withstand the conditions there. And so we're looking for something very pliable and at the same time very strong. And we looked a lot, and then we came across chain link mesh, which is something that is, as you can see, plies very beautiful to double curvature and at the same time is very strong. But it is designed for the body, for armor. It's now used in butcher gloves and fencing gear and belly dancing attire, but it is not something that really is made for architecture. It's not a material that exists within our architectural vocabulary. And so we started to test. This is the biggest you could buy online or in stores. And these were tests in our office, because what is the scale of the building rather than the scale of the body? How do you want this thing to appear? Like, how do you want it to look? And also, just, you know, what is the, basically what is its scale? And as we were doing tests, we were also trying to understand, how does it actually work? How does this thing take on this complex geometry? Because it's not elastic, but it works elastic, but it works because of the way these rings tie together. And so we started to understand how this thing works. We started to understand, what is acceptable, sort of how taut can this thing be. We mapped the whole building. And then we started to talk to our friends, engineers we had we had worked with in the past, Mike Ra, a friend of ours. And he said, well, if you now know sort of roughly how big you want this thing to be visually, let's start testing it. Let's see how strong it needs to be. Let's see how thick it needs to be. And we started to do some tests in labs, and very quickly they were able to model this thing, the whole skin, in the computer. And we had a perfectly beautiful CATIA model with every ring in there and its exact behavior. But because this thing was never done before, and we actually, at that moment, already had promised our client that we would realize it, we thought, let's have a parallel process and let's build the same building physically, and this is in our office, to a 1 to 10 scale. And just to check, so we always try to balance basically what you can do in the computer with what you can do physically, and I think that's the way we typically operate, checking the physical and the digital towards each other. And at this moment, we really knew what this was and how this would work. And so then we thought, are we now going to translate this into Korean and write a Korean spec for somebody else to build? And then we thought, well, that's going to take a lot of time. Why don't we just make it ourselves? And so we went to Alibaba.com, and we actually typed in ring mesh, and very quickly we got a lot of people asking us to Skype with them. And most of the people were actually coming from Anping, which is an area in China. And at some point we were Skyping for a long time with a girl who, strangely enough, her Skype name is Ring. But after Skyping with her for about a couple of months, they sent us this and said, hey, that looks promising, right? Maybe these people can actually make this. And so we flew to Beijing, and then we drove for 5 hours to the south west. And I don't know how many people have met their partner online first and then met in reality later. But we came into Anping, which was a strange town where you could buy dog on the street. And we came into this very small courtyard, which was not much bigger than this area here in front of the seats. And there was one guy who was hand welding this stuff together. And here's Jing, my partner, and there's Mike, the engineer, and then behind his ring. And Jing here is explaining that we need 500,000 rings. And so that it's probably impossible for them to actually make this, which was very disappointing. But also showed sort of how incredibly weird our world has become. Ring then said, well, you know, everybody in this town can actually weld, so why don't we just all do this together? And so we worked with them and with the whole community, and we found up sort of a new method to produce where multiple people could work at the same thing, because all these rings actually are being hand welded together, 500,000 of them. And so the whole community participated, and at some point there were 60 people working with us together in this place. And we made 14 of these large swaths of rings. This is the local car wash, which was used for cleaning. And we used another place for quality control where every weld was being checked. We used the schoolyard for a mock-up. This mock-up was approved by the locals, and in Korea the building itself was under construction and the things were shipped, and gradually these 14 swaths were hung around this building. And so what is interesting, because here you see it, and here you see the old sort of neighborhood, and there you see the palace, and that it sits really completely embedded within that old historic neighborhood. So you can never see this building as a form. It's not really a form, it just sits there in the middle, and you go through these alleyways, and suddenly so the building appears, you know, from really close up, but you can never actually grasp it as a volume within itself. And we were able to weld these rings, these 14 mats together on site in the same way as they interlocked in the factory, and so this became a completely seamless, sort of stretchy veil around the building. And where these stairs and other objects, they push it out, and there's moments where you can get in between the skin on your way up or in your way into the building, these moments between, so that it is very clear space for contemporary art and the more contextual historic context. And so also going to the basement, the stair sort of peels out and you are back into the site, and you come into this black box theater that they have below, where they show movies and have performances. And so the old and the new, they come together in a very different way, not by repeating its context, but in a way responding to its context, also in a way responding to, say, a certain investment in detail and articulation. I like this picture because it shows sort of the very crafted old roof of these old historic homes and the very crafted but new idea of our building. And the light over time sort of changes the way in which this thing appears. And so this speaks about sort of a deepened layer or defining skin. And there's a second project that maybe speaks to that we did at the same time, which was a space for a completely digitally operating company called Logan, a production company, and they all work basically in the digital realm doing renders and representations. And they needed a workspace in Soho, New York, typical project, old loft building in Soho, cast iron columns that set the grid. And they work very, very flexible. There's only 4 people work there, but they have sometimes 40 people working there depending on production. It's all freelancers. It's people that come in for different teams. So what they needed to have is an incredible amount of flexibility in the space. And what you typically then do is create a big open space. But sometimes there would be only 4 or maybe 8 people working there. And so we didn't want to create just this vast space that at times would feel open, but we also didn't want to create a space that when it was fully occupied, it would feel really, really dense. And so what we did is very simple. We made two very long tables. We put all the legs of the tables inside, and we put the chairs on casters. So basically groups can sort of huddle around different spaces. They can roll and organize themselves. A big infrastructure in the middle of the tables where people could plug in their computers. Massive server room and a mechanical room to cool the servers. Then editing booths here for the final mixing and sound, 1, 2, 3. Here where you enter, and a little kitchen. And then the boss was sitting at the same table here. We cut the table with a glass wall. Here's the meeting room for if they had meetings with clients. Here's where the boss sits with two assistants. And this is a photo studio. But everybody sits at the same table and actually works at the same space. And then we created this division in between these rooms with this stretched theater fabric that basically spans the entire length of the space. And you see those walls going here, and they take in them the old steel structure, and they also happen in front of the old the facade itself. And so what happens is you have these different groups working with each other in the same space, but they are teams that they don't have to work necessarily with others. And so they are aware of the other to an extent, but at the same time their presence is filtered out and pushed to the background. The ceiling is also stretched fabric with a dimmable ceiling, and so the whole thing can be calibrated also to create sort of a perfect environment for the screens that they're working on. They work with much bigger screens, but we didn't have them in, so this is for the picture only. But you see also here the old building in the background with its old plumbing and heating system that in a way sort of appears as a ghost within this backdrop. Here one of these tables, the meeting room with the wall, glass wall cutting through, and these editing booths. And here a video of the space. Okay, you already spoke about the museum we're working on now, and this starts to talk about presence in a certain way. It also speaks about this open structure, but it also talks about how does this thing now appear within a site. This is UC Davis, University of California, Davis. Davis is their most agricultural campus. It sits in the north of the Central Valley, just south of Sacramento. And so the heart of campus is sort of over here. And because most students focus on agricultural programs, but many of these people end up working in Napa Valley or Sonoma Valley, some of the people who own the vineyard said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if there was a little bit more, if they were a little bit more exposed to culture beyond sort of the studies that they're used to. And so what they've started to build here is sort of a more cultural cluster, which sits along the highway between Sacramento over here and San Francisco at the side. So the difficulty is it sits all the way at the edge of campus, but at the same time it's sort of the front face of campus. And so they built a performing arts center over here, a wine and food center there. And then there was a competition for a museum. And this was a design-build competition, which means that you not only have to come up with a design, but you also have to be there with a contractor and guarantee that you will not spend more money than that they have. And so we teamed up with Bowling Chvinsky Jackson, which is a firm from San Francisco, who you might know because they did all the Apple stores, and Whiting Turner, which is a big builder. And we had to think of how to make a museum for maybe a student body that not naturally goes to museums. Also, how to make a museum for that doesn't exist yet, that doesn't have a collection. How to make a museum for a generation for whom visual culture is maybe something different, where people are, in a way similar to the project we showed before, used to curate or tell their own stories, and how to think of a museum that in some way also speaks to its site and the fact that it is located in this landscape, and this landscape is not a romantic landscape, but it is a landscape of production, it's a landscape of cultivation, it's a landscape that in a way gives people also the power that they are sort of, that the landscape is sort of part of, say, the things that we construct. And so these were images that we used because it was a competition that there was a lot of exchange with the jury itself, because they had to find the right team. And so these are a number of images that we use to speak about this. And this speaks, for instance, also about how to make, how to give a presence of this building in this landscape, because it was at the edge of campus. How do you create something that comes from the landscape, but at the same time, distinguishes itself as a place within the landscape? And so we started to think of a museum not as a closed box, not a monument, treasure chest for the arts, but really as sort of an open infrastructure, something that could continuously change, something that had a very soft threshold, something that people could go into and occupy and do their own things in. And so we started to work, and so we worked through these study models to creating basically a very open structure in a way that sort of rises out of the plane without really thinking about program or organization. We also realized the building is actually quite small for the site, and the budget was fixed, and there was this desire for this thing to have a strong presence. So how to make something appear larger than it is, and also how to respond to the very harsh landscape or the harsh climate that can happen there during the summers. And so we thought, let's make something that basically takes over the entire site as a large open canopy that covers basically the whole site and creates a variety of spaces both inside and outside, independent of its program. And so this again from on top, you get this sort of variety of different spaces, dark and light, open and closed, large and small, that come together as sort of a patchwork of these spaces. And only after we started to sort of project functions or zones in which some of these functions could start taking place. And ultimately the scheme is this sort of continuous field. The campus continues into the site, and within that you find this field of different types of spaces that come together under this large canopy roof. And so in a way the form defines this specific place on campus. And this one we won, which was nice. And so we could start building them. But because it was design built, it also meant you had to make very many decisions very quickly, and those things needed to be immediately known products, because the building company wanted to exactly know how much everything costed. And so we had initially thought of this canopy as perforated metal that covers the whole building, because that was the only product we could find that had a number. But we also realized that that's not completely right. And that was also right when the drought became a real sort of urgent issue in California. And we felt we needed to continue to develop the scheme, and in a way this idea of a variety of spaces and the climate and the environment as something that is really tangible or can be experienced while you are there was something we wanted to get into the building itself. And so we started to look at there's a beautiful arboretum nearby, and we saw the way the trees create shadows, and tree shadows are very interesting because they have depth. They're not, so the flat perforated plate would only create one type of shadow because it comes through one plane. But if you look at tree shadow, it's deeper shadows, and they vary from very crisp to very fuzzy. And we were thinking, how can we introduce that into the building itself? Can we work with an articulation of the shadow that creates sort of this variety of edges and borders? And so again, we tested, this is all physical models, this is all digital models in parallel. And we came to the idea of how can we create sort of multiple layers of shadows that fill in, this entire roof. There was a very tight budget, so what we decided to do is collapse basically the secondary structure and the infill panels, because basically we had primary steel, then there would be secondary steel, and then there would be these panels. And we said, what if we make the secondary infill, or secondary steel the infill, and actually fill the entire roof with these deepened, triangulated, perforated beams, because this gives us an ability to play with the shadows and the way the shadows come through the building. These are the three parameters that we could play with. The spacing of these beams, the orientation of them as the sun changes, different shadows come through, and the openness of the material. It also allowed us to very exactly control the quantity. And because our budget was set, it allowed us to actually have a very long control throughout the whole process to understand exactly how much material went where and how to sort of create this variety throughout the system. And so we set up, this is the outcome of sort of the density and the orientation of the infill. And so certain areas where art will be are always in shade. Certain areas that you can never see from straight below but are further away, they're spaced wider. And so this allowed us to really sort of work and calibrate with that system of infill. This is a mock-up we did to test and to see different finishes and starting to look at these patterns. And these are some early pictures of construction. This building will be done during the summer of next year. Here you see the large galleries and also the sort of the height of the canopy, which will actually go beyond that which is now being constructed. And back in China, a different group than the people that made the rings, but we're working again with front to fabricate these different triangular beams. So a temporary installation very quickly. This is expanded metal mesh, the same mesh we used on the new museum, which is a very simple flat plate that you cut. And by cutting it, it creates this sort of stretchable fabric, which we used here. And we started to think, what if you cut differently? What can you do if you cut differently? What if we cut in a circle? How can it expand in that way? And so we did the same thing. We got a sheet and we cut it in a circle. And we made 16 of them for the Architecture Biennale in Beijing as a little pavilion opposite the Olympic Stadium. And in some way here, we started to also think and experiment with the testing of sort of this deepened layers and sort of light bouncing through sort of a deep mesh. So the third thing is presence in a sense of volume. If these others were about structure and about edge, now last chapter about how to design a volume, how to think about a volume, and so this is a project for an art building we're doing currently in Brooklyn in New York, which both houses art and at the same time is a place for performances, artist studios. So there's both a collection, there is gallery space, but there's also artist studios and performance spaces. And so these are two works of art. On the right is my friend Anna Pravacci, who is a performance artist, and you'll get the clue soon. On the left is Man Ray, the Enigma of Isidore Ducasse. And both of these works, they speak about the presence of something. They announce that something is happening, but it is not completely clear what is happening, right? It's not transparent, it's not open, but at the same time you realize that something is going on. Now I'll fast forward this a little bit because otherwise it's... Oh, no, it was the end. Sorry, you got the clue already. So we started to think for this building how to give shape to something that is not completely accessible, that is not about transparency, but it is also about announcing that something actually happens on the other side. And these are very simple form studies we started to do with articulated volumes that in a way represent program, and at the same time sort of finding a way to veil this or hide it. The program is straightforward. As I said, it's in a street with 2 buildings on either side. It has studios, galleries, administration, and storage. And so we started to experiment and see, how do you make things, how do you find a form that sits sort of somewhere between the legible and the illegible. And we ended up realizing that we don't want to wrap this whole building in one sort of thing, but that there's maybe these multiple components that come together and in some way present themselves as this puzzle of those kind of pieces. And so this is the building in a certain stage before the end of schematic design, but it is pretty much the way the design to an extent remained. And so what happens is that these, wherever these volumes push sort of towards the edge, it's where the building opens up to let people in or to let light in there, windows or skylights or ways in which to sort of negotiate with the exterior. And so this creates this quite complex geometry, and wherever these elements push out, you see it opening up and you see light coming in. Creating different opportunities for skylights or clear stories, and even a room that has both a clear story and a skylight. And so this is the building as is, which we want to make out of cast-in-place concrete. And again, we worked here together with a friend who is a very good mathematician to help us understand what is the geometry of this stretch. And also, with that, we could actually define how taut do we want to stretch this material as form between these frames. And at the same time, in our office, through casting, we started to see also what are these forms and how does it bring light in. And now we are about to start construction, and we're working with a construction manager to figure out how to actually make this very complex concrete curvature. And so these are historic examples, Felix Candela or Saarinen, but those all work with ruled surfaces, so surfaces you can build up out of flat planes. But our building has geometry that you actually cannot build up out of flat pieces. This is the geometric model here, and again we work with friendly engineers on the right, the structural model. And so what is interesting is that this is sort of a hybrid structure that transitions from, say, shell structure to column, and this shows the thickness. So the blue is 2-inch and the red is 6-inch. So this concrete structurally has to basically is sort of a hybrid between something that spans as an arc, but at the same time is a column. And so now we are testing different methods of how to actually make these. These are 2 ways we probably won't go. One is milled out of foam and then held in place. The other is a research we're doing with, or a friend of ours is doing at the ETH in Zurich, who's looking at fabric casting, which is the most efficient way to form concrete. And this shows a test of that foam casting. But most likely we will work actually in wood, but with digital fabrication that cut all the pieces in sort of this complex geometry. This is a company in New Hampshire, and this is the museum they're currently building in Miami, the aquarium by Grimshaw. And so this building will start construction hopefully very soon. We are early next year we should start. And so this building then led to other fantasies and obsessions that we're now exploring about things that sit in other things, and they have informed a very small installation we did in LA recently for a bust, but also a larger competition entry for a building in London, which we didn't win. And here we applied it to a temporary installation, and it brings it back maybe to the beginning, and also that installation that I showed in Shenzhen. This is the storefront for art and architecture designed by Vito Acconci and Stephen Hall. And what is very fantastic about this building, I don't know if people have been to New York, is that it is a facade, but the facade opens up and pushes into the street and sort of in a way creates this space in between the private, in between the space for art or culture and the city. And it's also in a way a facade that agitates, right? People walk into it and like there is like a friction between the, say, the private interior domain and the city itself. And so we made an exhibition, we curated an exhibition which is here on the right about blueprints, which I won't speak about, but we also had to make an environment for and respond and create sort of an environment for this exhibition. And we wanted to think, how can you rethink or reactivate this facade? Also, the show happened in the middle of winter, and we really wanted to find a way in which this facade could open up. And so what we decided to do is actually shrink wrap the facade itself. We spoke to one of those guys that shrink wraps yachts and helicopters, and he came in and he wrapped the entire facade in this way. So suddenly the thing becomes a little bit illegible, so still something is happening, but you don't know exactly what. And at the same time, actually the facade can be, experienced and understood in a completely new light. And so we pushed back into the city, and very quickly the city pushed back to us. So that's it. Thank you. And so now I take some questions, right? Yeah. How is a very difficult question, right? I think you could argue that it's interesting. The other day we did sort of a session between architects and people in tech. And with tech, you launch something in a beta mode, and all the flaws and errors and mistakes, they come out in the open, and there is some media disasters and some lawsuits. But that's the way in which you think through design process in a product. It's like putting it out there and letting the world talk back, and through that you actually improve on the idea. Which is a very different way of thinking than the master plan idea, where you think the whole thing through, everything till the end, and then you try to make it, and then obviously things turn out to not work and what have you, and the same problems happen. And so I don't know if it's our time, but I do think that this type of thinking, which is sort of maybe a different attitude towards what it means to make something, has affected us in some sort of way. I also I do think that maybe because both of us are not in our, say, normal environment, so you have to sort of improvise and figure ways out to get by, so to say. I mean, we moved from I moved from Europe to Asia to the US. Jing moved from Asia to Europe to the US, but we are sort of in foreign places, and it forces you to just hustle in a way, and so that I think has affected the way we have started. But and I think these things that I spoke about in the beginning really have affected our thinking. It's like we can't claim with certainty anymore that anything we do will actually make it better. So can we find an architecture that allows us to reflect on that fact, rather than anxiously tries to hold on to something that is inevitable? And I think maybe indeed try to find sort of a new beauty or way to think about it through the work. So I think that's what we try to do with the work. So I don't know if it answered the how, but it does, yeah. I think it's useful to relatively early on start thinking, what are you going to make this of? And at the same time, sometimes it's the other way around, and we think, what could we make with this? And what could we make with this is typically things that you don't normally use in architecture. We're trying now to do a building out of sheet piles. And what is what can you make? I don't know if it's going to succeed or not, but we're trying. But things that are maybe close to architecture, but not, really yet UL listed products that you can specify, in a certain section or something. So I think it can go both ways, but I do think that it is useful to relatively early on think what is the logic, the material logic. And for instance, even because we work now in different cultures and countries, which countries are, you know, which building industries are better at what? So meaning in Korea there's quite a good concrete industry, and we thought it would be very interesting to make a concrete building. I mean, so, you know what I mean? Like we also think a little bit about where are we making this and what can we do with that. So yeah, it comes sort of, they emerge. But very early on we start thinking about materials. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Another lost competition that I didn't show was because everything got the evaluation happened with point systems, and so you could get points for efficiency, right, material efficiency, or programmatic efficiency, and cost and sustainability. And then they said if there would only be a point for beauty, you would have won. But of course, we can't measure that. And so I think it's very interesting to think of the fact that a lot of what we make these days is decided upon by 50% of what a building is, which is the percentage that we can quantify. But then there is a whole range of things that we can't put numbers to and people are not able to really speak to. And so this is where we are not interested. Well, I think if you would be able to optimize the things that you cannot quantify, then we would be in a very different place, which means that beauty or comfort or, you know, how a space affects you over time. But those are, I think, still things we can't measure. And so I think I do believe that we need to understand these mechanisms very well, but I think we should also acknowledge that they only speak about a very small part of what we ultimately decide.